What's up, Fly Lovers? Back here with Ship My Money to break down Monday Night Football slate. Falcons at Eagles. Sorry, we are a little bit late. That is on me. It's actually people blaming Ship. I'll take the blame for this one. I had to finish my Monday Night Football article before we get started. Happy to be back though with Adam. Adam, how was your weekend, both from a DFS standpoint and a real life standpoint?
Real life, it was fine. DFS, it was frustrating. College football was okay Saturday, but bad day yesterday, and then also compounded it, which is the part that I think I'm most frustrated about. I was having a bad slate. Like I didn't really have any of my main teams doing well, but I did have a good team in like the $50 single entry, 10K to first, and it was a good team. But then by the time you got to the 4 o'clock games, it was pretty obviously just going to be a team that min cashed. It had Cup, Parkinson, and Yosivas to go. And I was just kind of over it with the slate and didn't bother making swaps when realistically should have just been global swapping all of my Cooper Cup to Marvin Harrison, all of my Parkinson to Gesicki.
Yeah.
And if I do that, I actually make like 15K on the slate. So
Oh no.
it was one of those where like it never actually works out, where you have a big day out of nothing when you make those late swaps, but obviously still should do it. It's good practice. You're going to make more money over the long run. And not doing it yesterday because I was just tilting the slate in general cost me a lot.
Do you think those are the swaps you would have made? Like, how confident are you that you would have swapped on to Marvin Harrison and Colby Parkinson or
Very.
Gesicki? Okay.
I liked Harrison a lot. I still didn't play a lot of him. It was there were a lot of plays like that yesterday because I thought the chalk was so strong yesterday that it was still difficult to get to a lot of like the lower owned plays that I was looking at and saying, I think this guy's better than the industry seems to. But Harrison was one of those guys like I talked about on my show. I had wrote about him and everything. So that would have been a pretty, I think, easy swap for me. And then assuming I made the Parkinson swap, it would have just been Gesicki because he was $100 less or whatever, and right there.
Yeah, I didn't make any swaps yesterday. I see everybody in chat talking about I was lazy with swaps. Yeah, good to see you, Obi. That was not related to swaps, but good to see you also. Yeah, so I didn't make any swaps. I was pretty dead from the get-go just because I was not really in on Kamara. I heard several people talk about Kamara as a play they really liked. I just honestly wasn't really into it. It was like he's facing a tough defense. He's not that good. Like he can get there as a PPR scam. I saw that, but it's like he's 7,000. This is the kind of play I'd rather play him at like 6,000 might be a little bit more reasonable. But at that price tag was like, man, he's not going to get there. He's going to be so inefficient. And then of course 4 touchdowns.
He was just a guy to me yesterday. Like I didn't have a take on him really at all, other than running backs really deep. If I get some Kamara, great. And he was in that single entry lineup I was talking about. But like the Saints are the perfect example too. I really liked that offense after week one. I liked them coming into the season, and I liked what we saw in week one. But it was still just like there's so many spots on this slate I like. I'm really not going to the Saints against the Cowboys here, even though I do think they're a good offense going forward. So like that's another example of just one of those spots. But yeah, it was a weird slate for me because I had a ton of Debo, a ton of Breece Hall, and so like all the chalk is smashing except for those guys for like the first half, so it looked like really bad. And then they slowly like kind of got there, but all the other chalk still got there. So it was just it was a dumb slate. But again, I shouldn't have given up on it halfway through.
Also, Cooper Cup. I was super in on Cooper Cup. Like I really just jammed that chalk. It was like, well, it's impossible to fail without an injury, and that kind of appeared true. Like honestly, the first half they played horribly. They barely moved the ball, and he had 7.7 fantasy points prior to being taken out in the first half before they had 3 attempts at the 3-yard line. So it was like the expected fantasy points there would have been even more. And he, at that point, it's like, okay, he has what? 9.5 would be like the expectation mean there for Cooper Cup halfway through in a horrible half. So it was just like it was such great chalk, but then he got hurt in the first half. And what are you gonna do about that?
That's how I feel about Debo too. Like obviously he ended up having like an okay game. It didn't make or break you, but he had his most air yards since like 2021. He did it without getting like any red zone touches, which he gets even when McCaffrey's healthy. So that was something that more often than not he's going to get. So it just felt like one of those like, yeah, he was fine, but realistically that was probably like a 25th percentile
game. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was a tough slate. I actually like as far as losing money goes, I didn't lose like there are slates where I get back 10% of my entry fees. I think I was pretty close to getting back about half of my entry fees. Like so considering how bad I thought it went, felt okay about getting back about half my entry
I'm jealous
fees.
of that one. I think I got back like 20%.
Okay, yeah. So that went okay. I was super into the Cardinals Rams game, and at least the Cardinals end of that game ended up going really well.
Yeah.
All right, well we will get into this game. I know you guys didn't come to hear us complain about the slate from yesterday, so we'll get into the Monday Night Football game, starting with the quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, defenses, kickers, and then take any questions. We're not going to build lineups on this show. That's from my other show. The most important note at the top is AJ Brown going to miss this game for the Eagles. So we're going to have Johan Dotson playing a bigger role, most likely. And then we have to figure out who is going to be the next receiver up for the Eagles. That'll be a big thing to figure out today, because it's kind of different around the industry, how different people are projecting the third wide receiver for the Eagles around the industry. We can get to that, I guess, when we get to
I have
receivers.
like 2 options that I'm completely torn on.
Yeah, we'll talk about the receivers when we get there, because I'm in the same boat. It's like, this is, I don't know what to do with the Eagles receivers, but we can talk through it a little bit at least. Jalen Hurts, Kirk Cousins at quarterback, 2 very, very different quarterbacks. Kirk Cousins was already a statue. Then he has a surgically repaired Achilles at this point. Looks like even more of a statue this year. You can see it in the projection. Jalen Hurts 22.7 fantasy point projection. Kirk Cousins 15.1. Only a 1,000 salary difference between these two. Adam, starting with Hurts, how much interest do you have in playing Hurts today? Is he going to be in a majority of your lineups? Are you going to play him in the captain? What's your plan there?
Yeah, I mean, I think he obviously looks like one of the best plays. I think he's going slightly over-owned, both as a flex and a captain, but it's nothing crazy. And one player being over or under owned doesn't really drive, how much of them you end up playing. At 10K, given the rushing upside that he supposedly has, that we didn't really see in week 1, he is going to look good. But also, it's a slate where there's a lot of skill players, but not necessarily a lot that I have a lot of confidence in. So that kind of like pushes me back to getting the Hurts too. There are concerns over the offensive line. We saw that week 1, a couple of poor handling of snaps and just kind of miscommunications on the line, which really stands out since they Kelsey retired, and that might be something that they deal with going forward. So it's not a spot where I'm looking at Hurts and like super confident in him or anything, but still as confident in him as I am in anybody else on this slate, given how the Falcons looked in week 1 and really how the Eagles looked in week 1.
Last week we saw Saquon Barkley take those goal line carries, and I feel like I said it a million times this summer. Like, I could see the Eagles just give those carries to Saquon Barkley instead of Jalen Hurts. I said it over and over, and drafted 3% of Saquon Barkley in best ball, which I feel really dumb about.
Yeah,
it was like, I'm victory.
Barkley in best ball is probably one of the guys that I'm most pissed at myself about, because usually I'm pretty good about kind of like the meme where you have like the really dumb person. Yeah. I'm usually pretty good about just like on things like when it gets down to something so micro as like, well, what if Jalen Hurts gets all the carries from the 1 yard line instead of Barkley? And that's like a reason people are using to like fade somebody. I'm usually really good about just being like, yeah, I don't care. That's so micro. I don't care.
Yeah.
I'm still going to just draft the running back on the Eagles that, has had a bunch of success. But for whatever reason, and I think it's partly because like the sites that I use weren't ranking him highly. And then as we got further into the season, I started seeing people like data people posting, efficiency numbers for Barkley that suggested like he wasn't as good, I guess, as I thought in my head. And so I kind of just ended up just going with the whole, Barkley's not really a good pick. And then you see week 1 and it's just like, why didn't I just stick with the Saquon Barkley Eagles? Click the button. Like, it wasn't that hard.
It's still 1 week. It hurts because he scored so much that 1 week that it's like, you really need those spike weeks, and he's already had one. But, I'm not really willing to take the L just yet on Saquon Barkley. Part of the thesis is also like a lot of us are doing zero RB stuff, which is mostly for later in the season. You see a lot of starters get hurt, the backups come in and have bigger roles. So I'm not quite taking the L yet, but I'll probably take it tonight after he scores another 3 touchdowns.
I think the bigger L isn't that he had a big week 1. It's that if you were adjusting correctly for how it looks like NFL offenses are going to play this year, running backs would have just been going earlier.
That is true. Yeah.
So all
Across
of
the
Drake London, Chris Olave, although I do think Olave is still going to have a monster year based on what we're seeing in New Orleans, but just, Waddle, Olave, London, whatever you were taking in that range probably should have just been more of like Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, HN.
Yeah. So I anticipate having a ton of Jalen Hurts. I think he's going to be in a majority of my lineups. Probably not all, but like I would guess 80% plus Jalen Hurts in my lineups. I think he's just really solid play. We saw the rushing upside last year. He scored I want to say 15 rushing touchdowns, had over sorry, I was looking at my article for where I wrote it somewhere else. Over 600 rushing yards. He has in each of the past 3 seasons over 600 rushing yards and double-digit touchdowns. I think he had 15 last year. I do think, kind of the reason I thought he might cede some of those touchdowns to Saquon Barkley. Obviously, they don't have Jason Kelce anymore, but I also just think the shiny new thing in town is Saquon Barkley. So just getting that involved a little bit, getting Saquon some touches at the goal. And I kind of thought that was foreseeable, but I don't know if it's going to be the case all year. If that might have been just like, all right, you just showed up, let's hit him the rock. Maybe at some point going forward, Jalen Hurts does take on more of those goal line carries again, because we obviously know he's very capable of it. So I, love the rushing upside for Jalen Hurts. It's a minor concern for me though. Like if he's not guaranteed to get those goal line carries, that obviously hurts his upside quite a bit. But yeah, I still think he's going to be a big part of my lineups. From a stacking standpoint, I prefer to have him stacked. You definitely don't need to have Jalen Hurts stacked, but I generally prefer to stack my quarterbacks and definitely not definitely. I should say you can have him unstacked in the captain spot, but I would be willing to play him, or I prefer to play him with at least one stacking partner, even when he is in the captain spot. Adam, have you run your sims this morning? Can you give me any indication of how it came out in the sims with you? How your stacking Hurts?
Yeah, so with him at captain, I it's pretty much showing exactly what you just said. I prefer having him stacked with somebody. It's not as important as it is with some other options. Like if I look at the flex players that show up most frequently when Jalen Hurts is the optimal captain, the most frequent guy is actually Robinson at like 60% of the time. Then it's Smith, Goddard, Barkley, all between 45 and 55%. And then it drops off to other Atlanta guys. You get some Dotson at like 28%. Then you get down to, kicker, Eagles defense. So
Okay.
a lot of times when I look at that, with a quarterback that doesn't have the same sort of rushing upside, or that has a more clear cut receiving group that you can be confident in, you'll see that show up as 70, 75% of the time with like his wide receiver one. So Smith coming in around 55% is lower than you see with a lot of quarterbacks.
That's interesting. Yeah, and kind of as expected. But yeah, the general way I'm going to play it, I prefer to have the stack, but obviously he could just score multiple touchdowns on the ground. You definitely don't need it. The other side would be Kirk Cousins, where I'm always stacking Kirk Cousins. I would assume the Sims aren't giving you a ton of naked Kirk Cousins, just zero rushing upside for Cousins. I'm curious, how much Cousins are you getting to in general? I haven't run any Sims or anything, but he's obviously not quite as quite an auto click as Jalen Hurts. Like Jalen Hurts, just with the rushing upside, feels like a much better play. Kirk Cousins looked pretty bad last week. I don't know. How do you feeling about Cousins on this slate?
Yeah, so this one, I'm not really sure what to make of it. It's weird. So Cousins, I have showing up as going really under-owned in the flex spot right now. I have him showing up as optimal at flex like 44% of the time. The thing that's weird in that I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe it has to do with correlations. I don't really know. I have Cousins projected for fewer points than Devontae Smith. Devontae Smith is less expensive than Cousins, but I have Cousins showing up. I guess it's because Smith's getting a lot of captain optimal. Yeah. So Smith's showing up a little bit less optimal at flex, but he's getting way more ownership. Whereas I think that overall Smith's ownership is just a bit high across the board. But then also like Cousins as a flex is showing up more frequently for me than Smith. So he's actually going really under-owned at flex, a little under-owned at captain, but it's much more so that I just think he's a good flex play.
Okay. Do you think you'll have him in more than half of your lineups?
So he's showing up optimal like 44% for me. I would think if I were playing large field for Showdown, I typically play 3 max, but if I were playing large field, I would guess that I was coming in somewhere around half.
Okay. Yeah. That's generally how I think I see it also, like probably right around 50%, maybe a little bit lower. Haven't run lineups yet, obviously, but yeah, it seems like he's a quarterback on a Showdown slate, basically always a pretty good bet in general. I will say always stacking anywhere I have him in my lineup, and prefer to have at least 2 pass catchers anytime I have Kirk Cousins in the captain spot. Do you have any indication through your sims of how often you are double, triple stacking Kirk Cousins when he's at captain?
Yeah, I'm not sure how often I'm double or triple stacking. I do know that I'm still pretty spread out on his stacking partners. And I think this just speaks to the number of ways that it could go. I would assume that I am very frequently stacking him, but like when he's captain, Robinson is in those lineups 63% of the time. Then it drops off to like 43% McLeod, 40% Pitts, 40% London. So it's really spread out. It's, again, not one of those situations where I'm getting 70, 80% of one player with him. But I don't think in this case, like I was saying with Hurts, that's probably an indication that you can make some good lineups where you just aren't stacking him. In Cousins' case, I think it's more so that there's like 5 different guys that you can realistically pair with him as stacking partners.
Yeah. All right, we'll move on, talk about some running backs. Byron, just to say, I'm still doing Showdown articles. They are now at Fantasy Points. They are behind a paywall at Fantasy Points. I think they were at Stochastic also. But yeah, if you want access to my Showdown written, if you prefer the written form, those are at Fantasy Points now, and you can get 25% off with promo code Flannelman. The NFL Premium is what you would need to access that kind of content, premium written content at Fantasy Points. So check that out if you haven't already. If you want access to the data suite, stuff like that, which that's what I have over here. This is the data suite. We'll look at it at times throughout the show. Still 25% off using promo code Flannelman. And that's a different package you can find at the top of the Fantasy Points page. All right. Moving on to talk about some running backs here. Bijan Robinson is the highest projected running back on the slate. Really high usage last week for Bijan. Looked really good. I'll pull up the bell cow report actually while we're looking at Bijan. So last week, 45 of 50 snaps, 90% snap share for a running back is pretty near the top of the league. 18 of the team's 21 running back carries saw 5 targets on 71% rep participation. All of this seems like very good, very, very good usage for Bijan. Probably going to be a big part of my lineups, going to be a big part of the Fields lineups. What are you seeing with Bijan, Adam?
I have him right now as by far the most under-owned captain on DraftKings. And I think it makes sense. Usually you don't love playing a running back at captain because, as we've talked about before, it makes it a little bit more difficult to make like the correlations in the rest of your lineup make sense. But in Robinson's case, like he's so involved in the passing game, you can obviously just pair him with Kirk Cousins and there's receiving touchdown equity there. But he just is so likely to dominate touches in this offense, both between rushing the ball and getting receptions, that he's not your typical running back. So that makes him look a little bit better. Right now, have him projected for like 13% ownership at captain, 19% chance of being optimal at captain. Jalen Hurts is the guy that is in those Bijan captain lineups most often. So I think that signals that maybe you can make some good lineups that do make sense where like you have Robinson captain and then it's like a Hurts stack with his receivers. But, if Robinson does catch 6-7 passes, he can still pretty easily, be competitive with Jalen Hurts from a raw score standpoint. Or maybe it's like Robinson plus Cousins and then Hurts and his stack. So I think there are some pretty good ways you can go with him at captain. He looks fine at flex too. I think overall he's mostly just going pretty under-owned, given the workload that he had week 1. I think, if I remember correctly, Fantasy Points had him with like the 9th highest expected fantasy points at running back in a game where the Falcons just flat out sucked across the board on offense.
I can show you. Expected fantasy points. Where is he here? 10th highest. Okay, so after last night, 10th highest. 18.6 expected fantasy points. Yeah, in a very bad game for the Falcons. That is a good note against a really good Steelers defense. So I think that really held him back a little bit. Remember this offseason when the coaches were saying, Zach Robinson came out and said, Tyler Algier is going to have a big role. There are going to be times we're going to lean on him. 3 carries last week on 9 total snaps, ran 3 routes. Not a huge role for Tyler Algier last week. What are you thinking about it though? That's one game. It's so it's kind of like, all right, the coach said one thing, didn't happen in the first game. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen. He also said we're going to lean on him at points during this year. Does he mean like if Bijan gets hurt, or do you think is it going to be ever when Bijan is healthy? I don't know. I 3,600, I believe. Here, I'll pull up the this back up. He is 3,600 for Tyler Algier, projects for 4 fantasy points. Usage not great last week, but again, the coach said something different. How are you playing Algier tonight?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to get to a lot of Algier, but I do think this is a tricky spot. So he's getting like 10% flex ownership. I think that's pretty much correct at 3,600. Obviously, he's not somebody that you're planning on playing captain unless you are, I don't know, building a lineup where Bijan gets hurt in the first quarter. But it is a tricky spot because on the one hand, and we just talked about how heavy of a workload Bijan got in week 1 and how I think he's underowned and blah blah blah. Week 1 as a data point is very good for Bijan. We saw this, we saw him dominate touches. He looks better after week 1 than he would have if he really did split snaps and carries and touches with Algier. But you also have to keep in mind, it's much more likely that by the time we get to, week 15 or whatever, Algier is playing some sort of role than that he continues to get like 3 carries a game. So it's, you should still be projecting him to have a bigger role than he did in week 1. And you can find multiple games just from yesterday where, it was a reminder that you can look at how teams utilize their players as much as you want in week 1, but it's still one game. It's going to change. Like you had Deontay Foreman get twice as many carries as Ford after getting like 1 snap in week 1. There were spots that I was very confident somebody was the clear number 1 that ended up not being the case. So obviously Robinson is the number 1 here, but there's some risk that it does actually end up being a split in this one particular game. I think it's most likely that it's still not a split, but that the roles are, not as extreme as they were in week 1.
Yeah. That's it. Chocolum says he said this week he needs to get Algier the ball more this week. I did not see that. Can you by chance send me that quote?
The Bengals also said that about Chase Brown.
Yeah, and I can also go try and search it if you don't have that handy. But I did not see that come across my feed, so I will look out for that quote about Algier. That is interesting. It's also in line with what they said over the summer, and it hasn't happened yet. But the fact they just said it, it's sort of like yesterday with Cole Kmet. We need to get him more involved. I regret I made the wrong decision as far as I'm still going to full fade him. They totally didn't play him last week. Worked out though because Cole Kmet didn't end up doing much. How much did you get to of Kmet last night?
I didn't have Kmet. The thing that I was frustrated with, like I was happy about it, but also frustrated. I looked at last night trying to figure out who I thought would benefit with Keenan Allen out, and obviously you could make the case for Moore and Rome, but my immediate thought was DeAndre Carter steps in and plays a lot of slot snaps, and then my second thought was Shane Waldron likes using 12 personnel a lot. Everett's already been ahead of Kmet in routes run. I think Everett just runs a lot of routes out of the slot. So I ended up playing Everett in 2 of my 3 instead of Carter. And then Everett basically disappears. Carter's out there. Easily could have had a much bigger game than he did at 2K. So that was one. It was like, well, my thought process was good. I just ended up, picking the wrong guy. And I kind of alluded to it in chat that it's a very similar spot with the Eagles tonight, I think. So that was not ideal, but Kmet was out there a ton. They still didn't really get him the ball a lot. But the stuff from coaches like that, I tend to not read into too much until I see it. I think it's a product of how much NBA DFS I play, but coaches all the time just come out. We need to do this, or we need to get this guy more minutes, or blah, blah, blah. And it's like, they forget that they are the sole person making that decision. And it still doesn't happen. Like, you'll see coaches all the time say stuff like that in the NFL too. I mentioned it, but one of the Bengals reporters yesterday said, expect to see a lot more touches or a lot more snaps for Chase Brown. They said that they needed to be closer. And I was like, doesn't make sense. Not going to happen. Didn't happen. If a coach says something that basically confirms what makes the most sense, then I'll buy into it. Like, I do think Algier plays more than he did in week 1 because he can't play less. And I don't think he just has a non-existent role all season. He's going to split carries or split snaps with Bijan this season made no sense from the time he said it. And it's something that I think could have just been ignored.
Yeah. This is what you're responding to in chat. Amandeep says 12 personnel with Calcaterra at tight end is, kind of interesting, I guess.
That's where, so, I mean, obviously we'll talk about it more, but for me, it's Johnny Wilson versus Calcaterra for who I think is actually benefiting with AJ Brown out.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess we'll talk about that more once we get to receiver and tight end. Paris Campbell also could be called up from the practice squad. Johnny Wilson also, still dealing with an injury, so he's questionable to play. So that kind of will have an impact as well. But we'll talk through that. Machine Learning wanted to know, can we talk through some game scripts at some point? Specifically, I want to know what adjustments you'd make in a Philly blowout situation. It'd be a Philly onslaught with the Eagles defense is probably how I would play that. Just have 5 Eagles, 1 Falcon on that team. Would include the Eagles defense in general. Trying to think what else. What else would go in there? Like, who would you want to be at the captain in the Eagles onslaught? Probably Hurts with multiple pass catchers. I don't know. Do you have
it
any
could be
thoughts
Hurts,
on?
could be Smith, could be Barkley. I don't know, that it's a tricky one for me because it's just not how I approach Showdown personally.
Me neither. Yeah.
Because basically if you are, for me, like my process is so like Sims heavy and everything, and correlations are something that you can include in that. I'm by using median projections and projecting the game to go the way that it's going to go the most often, I'm still going to get builds and get lineups where the Eagles smash and the Falcons suck, basically, without having to like actually go in and think through, well, what happens if the Eagles score 30 and the Falcons score 0? So that's something that, like, years ago when Showdown first came out, I think was something that I probably thought about more, or had to think about more. Whereas now it's kind of, I don't have to actually take that step in my process. But in general, you would just want to allocate as little salary as you can to the Falcons and as much as you can to the Eagles.
Yeah, I think the like meta has always been, you got to tell yourself a story with your lineup. So I think that's people always want to talk about game scripts, like, well, what's the game script you're playing for? Like, and that, I think it's generally good advice to say, like, okay, think through how the game could go, tell a story with your lineup. But also there's several different ways it could go for an Eagles onslaught. It could be an Eagles dominant performance. It could be, could be Saquon Barkley scores 3 touchdowns again, could be the way they score. And then you want Saquon Barkley at captain. You're probably still going to want Hurts just because he's going to get enough volume there. But then it's like, still, if the Eagles dominate, not necessarily everybody's doing a lot, because it could just be Saquon Barkley scoring 3 touchdowns. Nobody else scores any touchdowns, has that much of a workload. And you actually want more Falcons, even with the Eagles dominating the game. Could be the Falcons are playing from behind. You're getting, PPR scams from Ray McLeod again. From multiple Eagles, but from Drake London, from several different ways that it can go. So it's like, yeah, I think it's generally good advice to try and tell a story with your lineup if you're hand building, but also, like, regardless of the game script, there's multiple different ways that it can play out. It can be this passing offense gets there because they're playing from behind, just throwing it, and tons of PPR points are racked up. Could be that I don't know. It's just I struggle with it sometimes, because I think that there are a lot of different ways for different lineups to get there. Sometimes I can build a lineup and be like, well, there's like 5 different ways that I could see this hitting. So it's, I don't know. I struggle with that.
Well, and then the other thing too is that the more obvious the narrative is in your lineup, the more likely that other people are playing that lineup. And you really have to keep in mind too, it's a 1 game sample size where, like I had a lineup last night. One of the lineups ended up playing and it didn't cash, obviously, but it had Caleb Williams, DeAndre Swift, like Bears defense. And so my first thought was like, I should obviously just switch DeAndre Swift to Rome, because, if Caleb does well, it's more likely Rome does well. And it was like, well, you're also just going to get a lot more pairings of Caleb plus Rome, and Caleb can do well, and it can happen in ways that Rome still doesn't do well and Swift does better. And then you saw him, throw more passes to Swift than Rome. So it's like, we saw the Millie lineup in the Miami Buffalo game, the solo Millie lineup. Like, people were looking at it like, oh, this is a bad lineup. It makes no sense. And I think usually when people say that, they're just not really realizing how random one NFL game is. And if you put 6 viable players together, it can work out in one game.
I thought I looked at it and thought it was a good lineup. There was no obvious
there was something about it. I think it was like Achan captain with Bills defense or something that people didn't like.
I like that. That's kind of lineup that I play all the time. So so I think you're right that it's just they really want to like tell a story like, oh, this is the way it goes.
Right. The game goes completely perfectly. And
yeah.
And if the winning lineup didn't go completely perfectly, it was a bad lineup, and really like 99% of games, something weird happens.
Yeah. So this is a funny question from Joe Coldham. Neil, do you still optimize? Yes, I'm not using the old optimizer that I used to do shows on anymore. I am still trying to optimize. There's still learning pains for me, and it's not because the optimizers are super unintuitive. Actually, Jesse walked me through how to use the Roto-Runners optimizer, and I think I mostly get it. But so far I'm giving myself such little time on every slate, because like I don't usually do much until after the games, that I have not done well optimizing, and it's my own fault. It's not the optimizer's fault. It's because I have not given myself the time to make the lineups that I want to make, to really set things up in a way that makes sense. So yes, I am still optimizing at this point rather than using Sims, but I'm not doing a good job of it. So that's something I need to work on doing ahead of the show, getting it all prepped ahead of time. All right, so we kind of got off track. Sorry about that. Algier, what's your final, like, do you think you're going to be, what do you have for the projected ownership on Algier? Is he going to be a big focal point for you of your like kind of lower owned guys?
He just looks like completely neutral to me. He's getting 9 to 10% flex ownership, no captain ownership. He showed up 9 to 10% optimal at flex for me not a captain. So pretty much like a neutral play where I do think the low raw ownership is important. Like I said, it's what talking about guys being over-owned, under-owned is just one data point. It's not that you should just jam somebody in or not based on that. And the fact that he is cheap and sub 10% owned does offer value in lineups where you need a low-owned guy.
Yeah.
And then obviously there's contingent upside too, where if Robinson does get hurt, it's very, very clear who is benefiting from that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. He's like might not have standalone value, but we don't really know that for sure based on this one game. And then obviously the contingent upside is pretty clear there for Algier. Are there any other Atlanta run? I'm not playing any other. Avery Williams, Chase McClellan, not going to be in my lineup pool. I assume that's the same for you.
Yeah, I feel like I saw like good preseason reports on McClellan, but I don't think that has anything to do with today.
And then Saquon Barkley, obviously really great role last week, scored 3 touchdowns for the Eagles. Going to be fairly chalky. He's not projected for like an insane amount of chalk last I looked. Let me double check whether that is still true. Over 50% projected ownership, double-digit ownership in the captain spot. I don't know. That all seems fine. I know we talked about it last week, a couple weeks ago. I don't remember what it was, but you brought up how like playing a running back in the captain spot. One nice thing is that you're not funneled into all the same builds as everybody else, which I thought was a really good point. Is that a reason? Are you going to be playing some Saquon Barkley in the captain spot or mostly in the flex?
Yeah, so I do think he's going a little under-owned at captain and over-owned at flex. One thing I do want to point out with that too, though, is I do think that there is some volatility in how you project Barkley here, not just because of what we already talked about with Hurts and goal line carries and not having a definitive answer on how that's going to be handled. But I think the obvious assumption is that Barkley probably gets at least some sort of usage bump without A.J. Brown, whether it's, more routes out of the slot. He ran a few last week. Or more carries or whatever. But one thing that can be tough, like we saw it with the Seahawks, for example, when a team loses one of their biggest pieces offensively, it's not like basketball necessarily where the next guy just steps up and shoots more. A lot of times teams will change their game plan. And so, you saw the Seahawks kind of like, Charbonnet got all the carries without Walker, but they also just were a lot more pass heavy offense than they were when Walker's healthy. Maybe you just see more runs for the Eagles as a result of AJ Brown being out. And that would obviously be good for Barkley in addition to whatever increased passing game work he gets. So right now, I still have a pretty healthy projection on him, and I have him showing up as one of the best plays on the slate, obviously. But there is some volatility there as far as like exactly how well does he project, because he is the most expensive guy on the slate. I have him with the 3rd highest projection. So that's why you're seeing him getting the 4th most ownership behind Hurts, Robinson, and Smith is his salary. But if the Eagles were to just be more run heavy, then Barkley's projection would just be higher, but you're not going to know that until the game starts.
Another reason that I wasn't as into Kamara yesterday was I was super into Kyren Williams for that reason. It was like, well, I'm really into all these like tertiary receiving options for the Rams, but also maybe they just give it to Kyren Williams a million times. I agree. That's certainly within the range of outcomes that the team just decides to run it more when they don't have their alpha receiver there. Good time to remind everybody. We are trying to grow both of our channels. This should be streaming to both my YouTube channel, The Flannelverse, also to the Endgame Syndicate YouTube channel. If you have not subscribed to either of those channels, highly recommend it and also would appreciate it. We are both trying to grow our channels, Flannelverse being my channel. You might be watching on my channel, haven't subscribed to Endgame Syndicate's channel yet. Highly recommend that. A lot of great stuff. You can get Adam's regular DFS breakdowns on the Endgame Syndicate, which is always great. But then also, sometimes you hear from Brick75, Nerdy Tenor, Utica, a lot of great DFS players. So highly recommend signing up for the Endgame Syndicate. Subscribe to their YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. And if you're watching on the Endgame Syndicate YouTube channel, come over, subscribe to the Flannelverse. I'll be doing another Showdown breakdown after inactives come out tonight. Adam, anything else that you want to plug?
No, you nailed it. Endgame Syndicate.
Dub Club.
Oh, yeah. If you are just interested in my NFL content, you can use the link in the description on my channel to sign up for that. Gets you access to my NFL projections, optimal percentages, the sim stuff that I'm reading off on this show, game by game notes for the Sunday main slates, all of that. So all that stuff is included at Endgame Syndicate. If you sign up there, that obviously comes with access to Uta and Brick and Nerdy, and it's great. But if for whatever reason the pricing doesn't make sense and you just want the content for now, you can sign up using the Dub Club link.
Yeah, that should be in the description. Actually, I don't know if I copied over the right description. I'll put it in if I'm not already in this channel. I think it should be in the description of this video. Go check it out if you have not already done so. Again, please like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. All of that really does help us out quite a bit. All right. And 8Game, I think Adam just kind of went over what is behind the paywall. So I don't know if you heard that after you typed that question, but yeah, a lot of good stuff behind the paywall for the Dub Club subscribers. All right, back to the Eagles. Yeah, Saquon Barkley. Agreed. Yeah, tons of volatility in that projection for Saquon Barkley. I think he's pretty solid play. Again, going to be over 50% owned. My guess would be I end up with a light fade, which I feel like maybe I'm just a running back hater in general, in best ball season and also in DFS. I tend to in Showdown. I feel like I'm usually underweight to like the chalkier running backs, at least like the starting running backs are the ones that I'm generally underweight to, and I usually go heavier onto the backups. I think that's going to be the case again with Saquon Barkley today. Most likely, I don't think 3 touchdowns per game is sustainable. Of course, one touchdown will be plenty. Do you have any thoughts on, or do you think you're gonna? I know it's not a big data point for you, above weight, below weight, but do you have any idea if you're going to be over 50% on Saquon?
I would guess probably a little bit over. Like I have him coming in optimal 54, 55% of the time combined. Preferring him at captain if I can get there, just because I do think he's going a little bit under owned. Hurts shows up alongside him a lot, which I think is interesting. I could have seen that going either way, but I think it does make some sense. Obviously there is passing touchdown equity for Barkley. We saw that last week. But also, if they did just go more run heavy without AJ Brown, that is something that potentially, Hurts is using his legs more as well. Let's say it's a game where offensively, or let's say the Falcons find a way to basically just make it so Devontae Smith isn't really an option in the passing game, right? That would then lead to potentially Hurts needing to use his legs more, Barkley being more involved. So I think you can kind of see different ways that there is some positive correlation between the two of them, even though the main talking point is which one of them steals the other one's touchdown.
Extrapolating on that idea of maybe they just run the ball more, Kenneth Gainwell was the second back used last week. As you can see here, 14 snaps to Will Shipley's 4. Not great usage, just 1 carry, 1 target on 17.9% repetition. So even as the number 2 running back last week for the Eagles, not really great usage for Kenneth Gainwell, but maybe a little bit more standalone value there. Do you think like they might, if they're wanting to run the ball more, maybe don't want to tire out Saquon Barkley, maybe they go to Kenneth Gainwell a little bit more as well? Any thoughts on Gainwell as a play this week?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were buying into, to go back to that question about game scripts, I guess, like thinking in those terms, if you are thinking of a game where the Eagles run pass percentage is just skewed more run heavy than is being projected, that would be good for Gainwell, because what would most likely happen is you're getting more total carries for Barkley and potentially Hurts because there's just more, a bigger pie of carries, but you're probably not getting the same massive rushing share for Barkley because he's just going to need to come off the field more often the more that he's being handed the ball. So you would get a most likely lower rushing percentage for Barkley, but more total carries, which is good. And then because there is a bigger pie and a lower rushing percentage for Barkley, probably more carries for Gainwell than before. So he's not any sort of priority for me, but he is somebody where, if you really wanted to go in on that, what if the Eagles just run the ball a ton, then throwing some Gainwell in there, even with Barkley, makes some sense.
Yep, and we know that he also can handle a starter's workload, so he has great contingent value as well. I like that call of like you can play them together. People often ask that, like, would you play both running backs together? And I think I'd be more inclined to with the Eagles than the Falcons. I think it's more likely that they both have a significant role than Bijan and Algier, even though we talked about Algier might have a bigger standalone role this week than we saw last week. But I think it is more likely with the potential that they just run the ball more. I prefer if I'm going to play one backup running back with the starter, it would be Gainwell with Barkley. I think there's a little bit more likelihood that they just increase that pie, as you say, and get him more involved. And then finally, Will Shipley, rookie running back. Some people were really excited about him in hot best ball summer. I drafted some Shipley, assuming that he might have some talent, but not much of a role last week. Do you think he's playable this week at presumably low ownership?
I think it's a pretty tough sell this week. Like, to me, if you're playing 150 lineups in the Millie Maker, maybe you have some Shipley, but outside of that, he's not somebody that I have a very easy time prioritizing, just because I do think that he's likely to have a role on this team by the time the season ends. But we see it a lot. And one of the things that I did pay a lot of attention to week one that I do think is probably a little bit stickier than how guys were how like veterans were utilized is what rookies do teams think are just completely ready to go right out of the gate, and what rookies are being held back a bit. And Shipley was pretty clearly behind Gainwell in week one. May or may not change by week 12, but I think it's pretty likely that in week 2 he's still behind Gainwell.
It's at least interesting to me that he did run 3 routes on his 4 snaps. So 4 total snaps, not great, but ran routes on 3 of those 4 is, promising that they want to use him as a passing down back. They're like, all right, when you go in there, you're going to be running routes. It's promising. So
I'd like it more if Gainwell didn't also have that skill set.
True. Yeah, agreed. That does kind of hold him back a little bit. Yeah, it's
and if Barkley didn't have that skill set.
Yeah, true. We saw some of the rookies. Now I'm trying to think of. I feel like we saw it a few times this week where we saw rookies way more involved than they were week one. Obviously, Marvin Harrison Jr., but I'm thinking even running backs. We saw Blake Corum had a role this week. Of course, that was a blowout. So there are scenarios where he could get a little bit more run this week, and it's promising that he actually at least saw the field last week. So they do plan on using him a little bit. Like, yeah, I agree. He's a tough sell because he's 2,000. But I think he's playable at least. He's 2,000 and doesn't have that very clear contingent upside of like, oh, if Barkley goes down, then he's the guy. So it's a tough sell, but I think playable in a 150 set. I would have some. So I think we are in agreement there on Will Shipley. I think that does it for running backs. Anybody? Yeah, nobody else. And you want to talk about? I assume.
No.
Wide receivers, where it gets the most interesting. AJ Brown out this week for the Eagles. Devontae Smith steps into presumably wide receiver 1 role. I look back at game logs to see like, okay, when has AJ Brown missed time? Can we see how they use Devontae Smith? AJ Brown hasn't missed time since he joined the Eagles. So we have not seen it in the past 2 years, how they want to use Devontae Smith without AJ Brown, but we can kind of assume he's going to be getting even more volume. Saw 7-8 targets last week for the Eagles. Probably going to be a big part of their game plan. Of course, the defense knows that as well. How are you feeling about Devontae Smith?
So obviously I like him. I do have some concerns, but then there are things that I think are positive. And so it kind of just all comes out in the wash where I wish I knew exactly how they were going to use him. But I think clearly you can assume that his target share goes up and his efficiency probably goes down without AJ Brown. They did use him in the slot a ton week 1, which in the past has been very, very good for his production. And it was a reason that I started drafting a ton of him in best ball after they traded for John Dotson, was I thought it would move him to the slot more. Now, I don't know this week, does he go back outside more often? And they use 2 tight end sets with one of them from the slot. They use like Britton Covey in the slot with Smith outside. If they do that, it's in the past not been great for his efficiency. But Atlanta was also bottom 10 in 2 high looks week 1, which if Smith's playing on the outside, potentially you do have deep routes open on the outside of the field if Atlanta's doing that. So like there's a lot of moving parts where I don't know exactly how Atlanta's going to handle their defense to clearly slow down the number 1 receiving option on the Eagles. But the big thing for me is that Smith is cheap. He's 8,800 on DraftKings. So there is very, very clearly upside there. He doesn't have to have a huge game even to still be a good play. All of that being said, right now I do have him as far and away the most over-owned guy on this slate. And like he's still showing up as optimal very often. 4th most frequent optimal captain for me at 13%. He's showing up as optimal in the flex like 40%. So still over half the time he's showing up in the optimal lineup for me. But right now, at least with the way that I'm projecting it, it's kind of like the field is kind of jumping the gun and saying like you have to play Devontae Smith because AJ Brown's out, when there are all these kind of confounding factors of opportunity goes up, efficiency comes down. You see it all the time in the NFL. Like most of the time when chalk busts in the NFL, it's a situation where like a number 1 receiver is out. It's already a volatile position. And then there's a tendency to just say, oh, more catches for so-and-so, when really it's more looks for so-and-so, but the defense also is keying in on him more and he's playing a potentially different role than he normally does. And a lot of times it doesn't work out. So, looking at it yesterday, obviously the Bears have a bunch of other issues, but it's not as simple as just saying no Keenan Allen means DJ Moore smashes. Again, it's not like basketball where you're going down and you're shooting. And if your number 1 shooter is out, your number 2 scorer is stepping up. There's just a lot more intricacy and nuance to NFL. So I think Devontae Smith is obviously a good play. I do think he's going over owned. So that doesn't mean that, I wouldn't play him or I'm not playing him. It does just basically mean that there are fewer lineups that I think are likely to be good lineups that have him. This was actually a discussion that we were having in Discord at Endgame the other day. And a couple people, Nerdy in particular, I think put it a lot better than I had ever been able to. And I don't remember exactly the way he phrased it, but you can look, at the player level and say, I think Devontae Smith is going over owned. But at like the full lineup level, he can still show up in a lot of lineups because you can still potentially find like a lot of combinations. Or if there's like a low owned guy that you happen to be higher on in the field and you're going to play a lot of him, then you probably still be playing a lot of Smith in those types of lineups. You can still find very, very good lineups that have him. But as an individual player, I do think the field is probably overreacting a little bit to the positives of Brown being out and not considering the negatives.
Yeah, I love that, and I agree. Like I've always thought that, especially in like when a team is in the nut situation, like if they're facing the Commanders' defense, it's like I really don't want any added factors. Like I want the regular team against that bad defense, and then people want to react to it like, oh, this other player's out also, so that's even better for him. And often I'm like, no, I'm not sure that it is. I'd rather just, I want what I already know. I don't want more variables thrown into the equation. Now this case, that the Falcons are a fine defense, but it is just another variable thrown into the situation with Brown being out that we don't really know how to adjust for it. And I think you're right that the field is just going to assume this is great for Devontae Smith. He's going to be the number one guy. And that's probably, I think that is the most likely outcome, is that it is good for Devontae Smith, that he is going to be more a focal point of the offense, could see, 15 targets, something insane like that.
The way I always think about this, and again, like obviously a lot of my DFS background is NBA, but the way I always think about it is, like, to me, when wide receivers are in a position like this, it's the equivalent of like NBA, where your second scorer isn't very good at creating for himself. And he's going to be asked to because there's no other scorer. So basically the median projection doesn't necessarily move that much because he's going to get more opportunities, but he's going to convert fewer of them. But the ceiling does become higher because if Atlanta just doesn't scheme to take out Devontae Smith for some reason, or the Eagles have a good adjustment to whatever scheme Atlanta is trying to go with, if Devontae Smith can get open, the ceiling is massive because he's not losing any targets to AJ Brown. So without a doubt has a higher ceiling without him. The question is just kind of like exactly how much does that median projection actually increase? And does it warrant the massive bump in ownership?
Yeah. Big Bino says, I can't remember, but if y'all could look it up, every time Brown is out, the Eagles game script around a certain person, just can't remember. I'm double checking my work here, but I'm pretty sure we just haven't seen it. I don't think Brown has missed significant time ever with the Eagles. Like you just look through, this is his game log from last year, just snap share here, over 80% in every game except for week 18, which I assume is just not a real game last year. And then I think maybe you're thinking of Dallas Goedert being out, would be my guess. You're probably thinking of Dallas Goedert being out because, I looked through this because I wanted to check it out, and I don't see any games. I get 68% in this one, but Devontae Smith was also 64 or 74. I just don't think AJ Brown has really missed any time when he's been on the Eagles, so we don't have that data point. Just wanted to double check my work here, but I don't see anything there. All right, so Devontae Smith, a lot of volatility there. No AJ Brown, probably a better role, not guaranteed. I'm going to have a lot of Devontae Smith with the added volatility. Do you like him better as a captain play, just for the obviously the tail outcome? He could just put up a huge game.
I think it makes some sense for that reason. I do have him going less under owned at captain than at flex, even though I have him, or less over owned rather, even though I have him over owned at both. So I do think that, like, I guess relative to the alternatives, I like him a little bit more at captain. And that's kind of like what I was talking about with Kirk Cousins before, where I have Cousins going really under-owned at flex because, like, he's getting a lot less ownership than Smith. And I think that he's actually like a better flex play. And then Smith is less over-owned for me at captain because I think the range of outcomes still, the volatility does, if he's able to get open here, you probably want him at captain because he's just going to absolutely smash.
Yeah. So I like him as a captain play. Somebody was asking if they have brought anybody up from the practice squad. There have been rumors around the internet that maybe Paris Campbell will be called up. I don't think that they have activated Paris Campbell yet. And yes, people were talking about it in chat. I did see that Johnny Wilson did not practice on Saturday, which is generally a bad sign for his availability tonight, but still questionable. And the fact that AJ Brown is out, like he might try a little bit harder to get out there if he's going to have a real role. So not ruled out yet.
To the point about if Smith, how often Smith is in the slot too, I think Johnny Wilson's status does play a big role there, because if Johnny Wilson is active and the guy that steps up, like Wilson, I think would primarily be playing on the outside. Dotson, I think primarily would play on the outside, and then you can have Smith in the slot where he's most effective. If Wilson is out, Smith, I think, is playing outside. Like Britton Covey's more likely to be in the slot than outside. Obviously, if you're using like 12 personnel or anything, you're kicking Smith to the outside. So if Johnny Wilson's out, I think Smith's running the majority of his routes on the outside. If Wilson is in, they could still, mix things up and do things, still run 12 and have Smith outside some. But if Wilson is in, I think you do get a higher percentage of snaps and routes from the slot for Smith than if he's out.
I want to check out Paris Campbell's slot. I feel like he runs down from the slot a good amount, but let me double check that with Paris Campbell. Yeah, 81% slot last year for Paris Campbell. So maybe, I guess you're right. Either way, it would be probably Smith moving to the outside if Johnny Wilson is out, because it would be either Paris Campbell or Britton Covey. Britton Covey only played like 6 offensive snaps all year last year, so I feel like they don't want to use him on offense that much. Maybe that's wrong, but I feel like he's mostly just they start him because he's the punt returner. I don't know. Do you have any strong take on? Do you have a strong Britton Covey take?
I don't know. I mean, I'm with you. I think he's mostly a special teams guy. If Wilson is out, then there's more opportunities available, but I do assume they call somebody up, and mostly you just get a mess of 12 personnel, Barkley occasionally in the slot, Campbell in the slot, Covey playing some, but I think it's mostly like a mess if Johnny Wilson's out.
Yeah. Agreed. I would expect them to call up Paris Campbell if Johnny Wilson is out, and maybe he has a role, but kind of an unclear situation there. Johan Dotson, the other one that I think we can pretty clearly anticipate a bigger role for. Johan Dotson was already the wide receiver 3, now should be the wide receiver 2 with AJ Brown out. I'm pretty sure he's going to have a more significant role. How do you feel about it? As our resident Commanders fan, I guess you've seen a good amount of Johan Dotson. How excited are you to play Johan Dotson at 4,000 today?
Not at all, because the problem of him not being very good and struggling to separate still exists. This is like another perfect example of what we were talking about with Smith, where without a doubt, I guess there's some doubt, but very, very likely Johan Dotson is going to have a bigger role this week than he had week 1 with no AJ Brown. But whether or not he can get separation and earn targets and convert those targets is anybody's guess. And so his projection certainly, even more so than Smith, goes up relative to week 1, because week 1 he basically had a very small role, and this week he at least has the opportunity for a bigger one. But how often he converts is very, very volatile here. He is inexpensive at 4K, so he does look good as a value play. So I have him going over owned, but not by the same margin as Smith, and that just has to do with the salary. There's just less guys around a 4K price tag that, even in like a mediocre game for Dotson, that are going to beat him. Whereas if Smith has a mediocre game, there's no shortage of guys that are probably outscoring.
Yeah, good call. Yeah, he's agree with that analysis entirely. Like, he's obviously, like, you can expect more of a role, but he is not the same level of talent as Smith. It's still not going to be like, he's probably still not going to get double-digit targets. Could happen, but a lot less likely. So you really need him to capitalize on those opportunities, and less of a sure thing to do so with Johan Dotson. Still, I think a pretty solid play. It's all going to depend on where the ownership comes in, the extent that I'm going to want to play Johan Dotson. I think current ownership on Johan Dotson is over 30%. Honestly, that seems reasonable to me at this price tag. No issue with that. He's just too cheap for the wide receiver 2 role, but still, yeah, as you say, not a sure thing at all. We've kind of talked about the wide receiver 3 situation. Johnny Wilson, you can see here at Fantasy Points projecting him in and to have a big role for the Eagles. He is a 6'6" rookie. People are pretty excited about him this offseason, kind of hoping to see him have a role at some point this year. But he, again, did not practice on Saturday. I feel like it's more likely that he ends up sitting than playing. So I guess start with the scenario of, if Johnny Wilson plays, how confident are you in his role on the team? How much do you want to play him, assuming he's active?
So I'm not super confident, because it's his second career NFL game, and we have no idea how they're
Yeah.
actually going to handle their personnel here. But the opportunities for him would be there. I like that he's 1K. He's not showing up a ton for me in the initial sim that I ran, but I do think that it's something that maybe I end up adjusting as the day goes on. One thing that I would like, and it goes back to when I was kind of just naming all of the different factors for Devontae Smith, is that in week 1, the Falcons did use a lot more 1-high looks than 2-high. So you, in theory, have openings deep down the sidelines. And then if in this, hypothetical where they're running 3 wide sets, they're not using, when Wilson's on the field, they're not using 12 personnel. So you have Smith in the slot, you have Dotson and Wilson on the outside. I'm pretty confident the Falcons aren't going to deviate from last week's game plan and in a way where like they're leaving the field open for Devontae Smith over the middle. I think they're going to keep prioritizing not leaving the middle of the field open for Devontae Smith. So it's pretty likely that they are going to be leaving the outside open for Johnny Wilson to beat them if he can. So the matchup, I think, looks pretty good for him if he's healthy and playing, especially for a guy that's 1K where you shouldn't be caring too much about the matchup anyway.
Yeah. Show one says, I think Paris Campbell's marked out. You might be talking about DraftKings. That's wrong. We don't have the, I think the deadline is, I want to say it's like 4:00 Eastern or something like that, where the deadline to call up players from the practice squad, that hasn't passed yet. I just searched a little bit to see if there's been any like reporting on Paris Campbell won't play. The latest I've seen is it's pretty likely that he's going to be called up, but yeah, definitely not a sure thing, but places just mark players out incorrectly all the time, so I wouldn't worry about that yet. He still very much could play. Johnny Wilson, a lot of volatility there, even if he is active. I would have a lot of interest if he is active at 1,000, because I would think that he would probably have a role in the offense. But we're all just kind of guessing. This is his second NFL game. Didn't have a big role last week. He did play a little bit last week. Two total routes last week, so 1 target on 2 total routes last week, but the type of 6'6" receiver, like he might be more of a red zone threat, which 1 touchdown at 1,000 might pay off the salary. So I would be pretty interested if he does end up playing tonight. My expectation is that he probably won't after not practicing Saturday. But I don't feel that strongly about it. Again, I think he might be a little bit more inclined to play with AJ Brown out. So we'll have to kind of wait and see. Again, I'll do an update show right when inactives come out tonight, so I'll have a little bit more information for you at that point. So
the thing, like, Wilson is showing up as optimal like 5% of the time for me right now, which on the one hand does seem kind of low. He's also only projected for like less than 5% ownership. The kind of like doomsday scenario if he's active is that he's 1K, so obviously he's really cheap, but these potential tertiary Eagles pass catchers aren't actually that inexpensive. Britton Covey like 1,600. Grant Calcaterra is like 2,400 or something. So you have a situation where like if they do just kind of continue using a lot of 12 personnel. Johnny Wilson's on the field some. There is the potential where like none of these guys just get enough targets to actually be good plays, which I think is why you're still seeing relatively low optimal percentages on like everybody if Johnny Wilson's in. Whereas if he's out, then you probably do see optimal percentages come up a little bit on the other options because it's just one guy that's missing.
Yeah, I mean it's a thin wide receiver room if he is out, so you would at least you'd feel more confident in the opportunities if he's out. Whereas if he's in, it's just like we don't really know who they want to play on the field because Britton Covey, again, he's been active, but that's because he's a punt returner. Paris Campbell's been on the practice squad, but he also has a lot of NFL experience. He could just come in and play up from the practice squad. That's not out of the realm of possibility. So yeah, it definitely will be a lot clearer if Johnny Wilson does not play. That would be helpful in terms of limiting the number of players we need to think about for that third wide receiver role. Britton Covey, yeah, I don't think I'm not currently planning on Britton Covey. That might change by tonight if I see any kind of rumblings about they're wanting to get him more involved in the offense. But my assumption is that they don't really want to use him as an offensive player. It's mostly just a punt returner because they haven't really used him yet. Do you have any different thought on that? Do you plan on playing any Britton Covey?
Probably not. And it just goes back to what I was saying a minute ago. In my head, we were going to start doing this show and all of these random guys were going to be like $600, but they're not.
Yeah.
And so it's not as simple as, he caught 2 passes for 40 yards and that made him a good play because of what had opened up. There's so many relatively high upside skill players in this game. Again, not that we can have a ton of confidence in any of them individually for a variety of reasons, but the upside is there for like all these relatively expensive but not super expensive skill guys. That like 1,600 is Britton Covey is like tough for him to pay off, I think.
Yeah. Other side of the game, we have the Falcons, Drake London. Man, it was ugly for the Falcons last week. You just look at their report here. It was kind of shocking to see that the player who got the most targets last week, Ray McClard with 7. Then you have Drake London, Kyle Pitts, Darnell Mooney, each had 3 at, pretty good route participation. Kind of a mess. I don't know if Kirk Cousins is not fully healthy at this point from his Achilles injury, or if it was just a matter of they're playing Pittsburgh's defense, which is a very good defense. So I don't really want to take away too much from week 1. But Drake London still projects pretty well. He's only 7,800, projects for 14.3 fantasy points. Again, just 3 targets last week, but he did run routes on 82% of dropbacks. That is second on the team behind Darnell Mooney. Start with Drake London. How much interest do you have there? Are you getting him in the captain spot, just in the flex? How are you feeling about Drake London?
Yeah, I think the field's pretty much got it right on London, getting like 35% flex ownership, like 8% captain ownership. That's exactly where I have him as far as optimal percentage goes too. 7,800 is a good price tag. And, I said this going into week 1. It obviously didn't work out. But right now, the pricing that you're seeing on Drake London is still very much factoring in what he has or has not done in his NFL career. And the assumption is still that he is a good receiver and that a lot of his struggles have to do with Arthur Smith. And then now you, in theory, have a better offense, even though it was awful in week 1. And so you are paying, like, if he is what we expect him to end up being, you're getting a discount based on his performance in the past. Basically, the opposite of best ball this year, where you had to just pretend he's been a number 1 receiver his entire career if you want to get him. And so at that price, he's still going to look pretty good, even factoring in all of the question marks that we do still have. So even though I do have those question marks, still looks like a good play. And to your point about not reading too much into week 1 for Atlanta, this team specifically, when I went back and looked at week 1, my takeaway was basically I'm not even going to try and have takeaways from this team.
Yeah.
Because Ray McCloud had a 46% target share. 27% target share, 46% air yard share. None of this makes any sense. Nobody else on the team had above a 12% target share as far as the entire team go. So the only takeaway you could have is basically either this was just a complete anomaly of a game, or this Falcons offense is like unplayable all season long because Ray McCloud is the number 1 wide receiver. Obviously absurd, I think. So, I'm still very much tied to my priors on how I expect this offense to work going into it.
Yeah, I think that is the correct takeaway is no takeaways from week 1, because this was clearly just an outlier game. They were just trying to do what they could against a really tough Pittsburgh defense. You could have the takeaway that Kirk Cousins doesn't look like the big upgrade that we thought he was going to be, but again, small sample against a very good defense. I don't want to read too much into it yet. I think we want to see a couple more games before I really read too much into the struggles from last week. But yeah, pretty funny to see Ray McCloud 53.6% route participation, and then of course led the team by a significant margin in targets. And even more interesting, I looked up his first read targets. He was actually the first read on 5 of those 7 targets. Where is that?
He had the highest first read percentage of any pass catcher on the team.
Yeah, which is insane. They were scheming to get Ray McCloud last week. I think that was just a matchup thing where the Steelers were covering the star players too well. So like, all right, let's just get it to Ray. But we'll find out tonight if that is something that's going to stick.
Yeah. Like when I first looked and saw his target share, I was like, oh, he probably had a 3-yard ADOT, and it was just Cousins dumping it off because
that's what I thought too.
No, he ran deeper routes than Drake London and Kyle Pitts. I don't know what happened in this game.
Yes, very very strange outcome here. Probably not going to stick going forward. Darnell Mooney, 8.4 is the projection here, 5,400, so it doesn't project extremely well point per dollar. But again, you look at it, led the team in route participation, 85.7% last week, saw 3 targets, which again, same as Drake London, same as Kyle Pitts. Only Ray McCloud had more than that. So I do think he is going to be, I think he still is the wide receiver 2 on this team, even after what we saw from Ray McCloud last week. I think 5,400 is a fair price tag on Darnell Mooney. How much Mooney are you playing this week?
Yeah, I think 5,400 is still fair. A lot of zone coverage, if I remember correctly, from Philadelphia. So not ideal for, him running deep routes in general, but it was also a lot of one high looks. So maybe the outside opens up a little bit for him. Either way, I think if you're playing him, in a showdown slate, you're not digging into that too much. It's more so you are embracing the volatility of he is a deep threat, and if he happens to get open or even not get open and you just fit in a really good pass, like the upside is obviously there. The floor is also really low because of the types of routes that he's likely to run, and because the floor for this offense in general is still very low until we see that Kirk Cousins can actually still play quarterback.
Yeah, I feel like it's the same old Darnell Mooney. Like everybody loved him on the Bears for a while, and he just never did that much. He'd have random spike weeks, so he could have that random spike week. But not something that I'm super confident is like, oh yeah, he's guaranteed to have 6 catches or something like that. It's more like he needs to capitalize on the touches that he does get, which is no guarantee, but the upside is clearly there for 5,400 Darnell Mooney. Ray McLeod, I mean, he's 3,000 again, saw 7 targets last week, 5 were first read targets. Obviously, that's all very promising for him. It then to me comes down to, okay, is the field going to play him as though he's a 7 target guy who's going to lead the team in targets? And the ownership, I think, looked not that insane. Let's see. I mean, he's projected for over 22% ownership. Is that true around these? Let me check his. Yeah, he's projected for about the same everywhere I look, right around over 20% ownership on Ray McLeod. Is that nuts? Is that too much for a guy that we didn't really think was going to have much of a role coming into the year, or do we just need to adjust to what we saw last week? Do you think that seems fair?
Yeah, so first I just wanted to double back quickly on Mooney because Josh Gillen mentioned it in chat too, that they ran cover 3 43% of the time week 1. I was looking at fantasy points just to confirm. Darnell Mooney did actually last year produce more fantasy points per route against cover 3 than any other coverage. And again, it does go back to one high looks and his route tree, playing well against that. There's still volatility on those routes, but it is actually a pretty decent matchup there. As far as McLeod goes, I think the price tag makes him interesting just because, again, the takeaway from last week shouldn't be Ray McLeod is wide receiver 1 on Atlanta, but it should be he does very clearly have a role in this passing game. He's only 3K, 23% flex ownership, 2% captain ownership. Both of those numbers are pretty much correct for me. I have him going a little bit under owned in flex, but pretty much where he should be. So that's the big takeaway is he can be targeted a lot less and still be productive. The scary thing is he only ran routes on 15 dropbacks, like half of the dropbacks. So he could still just completely disappear. But at 3K again, I think it's still skewed toward him being a pretty decent option.
Yeah, honestly, I look at that 22% ownership. I'm like, that seems about fair because he's too cheap for a guy who got 5 first read targets last week. 3,000 is too cheap for that role. But again, we don't really expect that to be the case going forward. We expect him to have some role, given what we saw last week. So yeah, seems like a fine play. Seems like the ownership is fine. Not like a full fade for me, but not somebody I'm really leaning into. I wish I could have a hotter take on Ray McLeod, but that usage was real last week. Maybe some of it sticks. We'll find out.
Pretty similar coverage rates for what it's worth from the Steelers week 1 and the Eagles week 1. 71% zone for Pittsburgh, 62% for the Eagles, 18% man for Pittsburgh, 24 for the Eagles, 50% cover 3 for Pittsburgh, 43 for the Eagles, 71% one high looks for the Steelers, 65 for the Eagles. So, again, not a lot that I'm confident taking away from week 1 for the Falcons, but as far as, maybe we get a second Ray McLeod game, you are likely to get pretty similar looks.
How much do you care about those kind of rates? The how much 2 high you're playing, how much 3 high, whatever the defensive coverage is. I struggle with that because I'm like, I think it's good to try to find every micro edge you can in these games where it's hard to find micro edges. I'm also like, well, how many snaps do they play? They play fewer than 100 snaps over the course of a game. Like it's really like you end up, you're talking about differences between you'll see that look 1 to 2 more times over the course of a game than you would against a different defense. I'm like, do I really want to factor that in that much? Maybe it does. Maybe that gives you one more big play opportunity. So maybe sometimes there is some importance to it. I always struggle with how much do I want to dig into the defensive schematic matchups, the tendencies of the defense, and then also are they going to adjust to this offense? So how much of a factor is it for you looking at those tendencies of the defense and how a player does against those?
I don't think it's a huge one, and this is the first season that I've really bothered looking at it at all. But the way I kind of think about it is it's not going to move your median projection too much because, like you said, you're talking about a small number of plays. But I think it does kind of change the ceiling outcomes a little bit where, because like you said, it's all moving parts too. Defenses are going to adjust. They're not going to just, if week one, they played a team that didn't have any outside receivers and they have a tight end that's just running deep. They're going to play differently than if in week two they play a team that doesn't have a pass catching tight end and they have two outside receivers. Like, they're going to play differently. So, like, they're going to adjust. You see with Baker Mayfield, like, he is really good against man coverage, and teams play man at a lower frequency against him than anybody else. So all that, it's moving parts. It's a low number of plays. You're not taking somebody that projects as a bad play and turning them into a great play because of personnel or coverage.
Right.
But it does, make me, I liked Marvin Harrison this week because the Rams were likely to play a lot of one high looks as opposed to the Bills week one that played a lot of two high. And like, when you looked at the Cardinals in week one, like, all of the first reads, or the vast majority, were to McBride and Greg Dortch and not to Michael Wilson and Harrison. And I thought there was a good chance that would flip this week. So it's not that, it makes the median projection a lot better, but I do prefer if I can just kind of look at the defense that they're likely to play, and the most likely holes are where the guy runs his routes.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Like, that is definitely, it's a positive. It's just, it's not something that I spend a ton of time on. Josh says, you should look into that more. Some guys crush versus certain zones, man defense. So I know that there are players who do better against certain types of defense. Just a matter of like, well, every team plays a mixture of zone versus man. They play a mixture of different defensive types. So it ends up being like, okay, you see one more look against that type of defense, like, based on those percentages, based on the number of plays, or two more looks. Like, it doesn't end up being that many plays of the difference. But I think you're right. Like, it's good to look at that stuff, to look at, what the defenders that are likely to be on the player a little bit. Like, you can use that, especially in Showdown where you're really trying to dig for micro edges. I think that those are things that it's worth talking about. And it sounds like you've looked into it more than I have, some of the defensive matchups. It's not like a huge factor for me in general, just because of the very small number of plays we're talking about. But again, we are searching for micro edges. Just wanted to hear your thought process there, because I feel like we've talked about this a little bit in the past, so I know that we're kind of on the same page, that it's not like the biggest thing. I guess I guess what I really think is that a lot of people significantly overrate the defensive looks. I guess, like, people are like, this is a great spot for this player because they play man at the third highest rate in the league, and it's like 62% versus 60%. It's like literally maybe one play, and I'm like, okay, I don't care that much.
Yeah. To me, and like micro edge is completely right. The way I kind of think about it is, if you remember, I don't know, 5 years ago, like, umpire data in baseball became a thing. And right now it's that I don't think industry projections are very likely to be accounting for this at all. I don't think so. Like, for example, Devontae Smith, AJ Brown is out. Devontae Smith's ownership just skyrockets because everybody knows AJ Brown is out, and ownership is going to completely account for it. Here, I think that if you can just, like, be directionally accurate with, this guy is a slightly better play because of the defensive scheme that he's going up against, there probably is just a little bit of an edge there, because projections probably aren't accounting for it as well. And as a result, the field just isn't going to adjust to it. So even if it's a small thing, if you can, make some sort of directionally accurate adjustment, you're going to be better. But as soon as, I don't know, like in a year, when everybody is paying attention to it, just like people really started paying attention to umpires, you can just completely go back to ignoring it, because it's a very, very small thing. And you're still going to get most of your projection and signal from how often is the quarterback going to throw to the guy and all of that. The other thing that I think probably makes the bigger difference is not so much as like this guy versus this defense, but like in the Marvin Harrison example, just off the top of my head, like there were so many questions of why didn't he get looks and what's wrong and blah, blah, blah. And if you can just notice that, like, well, this defense played a way that logically you wouldn't expect him to get as many looks, and this now the upcoming defense plays totally differently. I think kind of you can potentially find spots like that for like low owned plays, but in general, it's just something where I think it's interesting to look at. I think it logically makes sense. And as soon as the vast majority of people playing are looking at it, I will completely stop.
I think that is a really good point, particularly with the projections and sims not accounting for. Like, those are the types of edges that I'm really looking for, because I'm like, well, most of what I'm doing is using projections to tell me like who are the best plays. I don't really need to do that myself. The projections account for most things that we're going to look at, but then when you can find those little things that it's like, okay, maybe projections won't account for this, and that means that a large portion of the field are not going to account for it if the projections aren't across the industry. So then it's like, okay, maybe it's something I want to factor in a little bit. Anyway, we spent enough time on it. We're already over an hour, so we will move on. But I want to talk about that because I feel like we've talked about in the past. I think it's kind of an interesting discussion because it's, again, something I think goes a little bit overrated, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't necessarily look at it at all. Kadero Hodge projects for 1 fantasy point. Not somebody that I have given a ton of thought to playing. Yeah, did not play a snap last week. Didn't run a route at least last week. Might have played a snap. I'm probably not going there. Are you going there?
No. I mean, he is 200, so that's nice.
Yeah.
But I have him optimal like 2% of the time in flex.
Yeah. All right. Any other wide receivers that you wanted to? I guess Paris Campbell was the other one. Oh yeah, I guess we went.
Because I don't have him in right now.
He's 200. So I think if Paris Campbell is called up from the practice squad and Johnny Wilson is out, I think he's probably going to play. Would be my assumption in that scenario, because I think the other option would be Britton Covey, who I think is mostly a punt returner. So I think if Paris Campbell plays and Johnny Wilson is out, he would be my preference over Britton Covey as the third receiver on the Eagles. Do you have any other thoughts there? Do you agree, disagree?
No, I agree. If he's up, I think he is likely the third receiver. I do think I have less confidence in like Campbell's role versus Wilson's role if Wilson is active. So like if Wilson is active, I think Wilson is getting a pretty nice share, a pretty nice chunk of routes. If Wilson is inactive and Campbell comes up, I think Campbell, if they play a lot of 3 wide receiver sets, is the third wide receiver, most likely.
Yep.
But I think they probably play fewer 3 wide receiver sets than if Johnny Wilson's active. That could be wrong. I mean, Campbell is a veteran. He has had some success. He's had plenty of injuries, but maybe they just throw him in there in the slot. But at $200, though, I do think it kind of opens things up more, where even if I do think he's going to be a little bit less involved, or I'm a little bit less confident in him than Wilson, 1K for Wilson is cheap, but it's not free. All the other guys are relatively expensive. If you give me a $200 guy that has a chance of being the wide receiver 3, that becomes even a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, we'll have to wait and see who is active for this game. I guess the other scenario is maybe Johnny Wilson and Paris Campbell are both in there. That's even trickier, but we can worry about that a little bit more when we have more information tonight. Any other receivers?
No.
Okay. Tight ends, Kyle Pitts projects for 10.9 fantasy points. He is 6,800. I think everybody kind of knows what Kyle Pitts is at this point. He's a guy who has underperformed throughout his career, was expected to be an awesome tight end, has not had much of a role, was playing with Arthur Smith last year. Last week, though, 78.6% route participation, saw 3 targets, same as Drake London, same as Darnell Mooney. I don't know. How do you feel about Kyle Pitts in this game?
Yeah, I don't know. Pretty much sums up how I feel about Kyle Pitts in general.
Yeah, in general.
Route participation was good. In theory, he's talented and should be able to earn targets. I don't know. I think the field's pretty much where I am, 21, 22% flex ownership, around 5% captain ownership. That's pretty much how my numbers look also.
Yeah. Yep. I think my guess would be that I end up a little bit higher because I still want to believe in Kyle Pitts. The projection's pretty good for 6,800. The price is right, but we have pretty good prices across the board here, so it's not like a huge smash. But what I would anticipate is I end up a little bit above weight to the field on Kyle Pitts, because I am just a donkey, and I'm just going to keep martingaling Kyle Pitts until he has a big game.
Going back to our previous conversation, one thing that I would point out that I don't like is that we are expecting Philadelphia to play a lot of one high looks. Pitts, in a similar matchup last week, was the first read 6% of the time, which was the lowest of any of their pass catchers. It's not I would really like getting, and this is, just an example that if this week they were playing a team that was going to play a lot of too high and, totally different than last week, it would be like, oh, maybe this is where Kyle Pitts shows up, but he still could show up. Like we said, it's a small thing, but I don't like that he wasn't the first read basically ever last week, and he's going to probably face pretty similar looks this week.
Yep. All right. So yeah, I think we'll see with Kyle Pitts. I think he's a fine play. I'll probably end up overweight to the field on Kyle Pitts, but not taking a huge stand there. I'll give it a little bit more thought. But yeah, we all kind of know what the deal is with Kyle Pitts. Dallas Goedert also could benefit from AJ Brown being out. Doesn't project that much worse than Kyle Pitts, and he's $1,000 cheaper. Projects just half a fantasy point worse. How much interest do you have in Dallas Goedert?
I think he looks good at 5,800. Obviously, there's more opportunities for him. If Atlanta is scheming to keep Devontae Smith from beating them, then Dallas Goedert will need to step up and potentially get more opportunities. So that's good. 37% projected ownership at the flex, 8 in captain. I'm a little lower than that as far as optimal percentages go, but pretty close. So, I think that overall he looks fine. I do just mostly have concerns about the efficiency of the Eagles passing game because one, it looked like shit in week 1, and 2, they're missing AJ Brown. But so I do kind of still have those same concerns about Goddard that I had for Smith, but I think, obviously the ceiling is higher without Brown, and he should be more involved than he would be if Brown were in.
Yeah. The Eagles, the field conditions in Brazil were very slippery, but I think that favors the offense in general because they can dictate where they're going. The defense has to react. So not a great sign that didn't look great, but I still think they're going to be a fine offense. They still put up a good number of points. It was just all to Saquon Barkley. Charlie Warner, we just got somebody in chat. The hot take, I actually legitimately think Charlie Warner has a better chance of scoring tonight than Pitts. That is a hot take. Charlie Warner last week, 6 routes run, 21% route participation. He did see 2 targets. Do you think you're interested in playing any Charlie Warner tonight?
He was the first read twice as often as Kyle Pitts.
Oh God, you're right. You are right about that.
No, I mean, it's the, if you're playing in the millie, sure, whatever. He's 1,200. If he gets in the end zone, there's a decent chance he's optimal. But I assume in like my 3 max stuff, he will not come remotely close to my lineups.
Yeah. All right. Here's Mike Lawrence. Good to see you, Mike. Former producer of the High Stakes Show, producer at Stochastic. Homer take, but the Eagles offense was much better second half. Played 0 snaps in preseason with new center, guard, running back, wide receiver, and offensive coordinator. So yeah, no, we'll allow it. This is Showdown. Anything goes. You can talk about whatever you want. That maybe they're got better throughout the game and they are ready to go tonight.
And to your point, like the assumption here should be that the Eagles offense is going to be good.
Yeah, because they have been good in the past. You would expect it. But yeah, Charlie Warner. I don't know how much Charlie Warner I'm going to get to. I think he's going to go low own, so maybe an interesting low ownership play. But then the other side, we talked about a little bit earlier, the Grant Calcaterra projected for very, very little ownership. Maybe they run more 2 tight end sets for the Eagles tonight. Do you think you're going to be playing that way a lot with Calcaterra? I liked it better last night with Gerald Everett. But I guess, 25.6% route participation for Calcaterra last week. Did see 1 target. Was he the first read on that target? See, this is how micro we're getting. He was the first read on his only target last week. So that's, I don't know. Do you think he has a bigger role this week with AJ Brown out?
I think he has a bigger role. Because I just assume they used 12 personnel like 24% of the time last week, if I remember correctly. I assume that number goes up at least some just because they have fewer wide receivers that they want to play this week. I thought he'd be just a little bit cheaper. So that, like, coming in, I thought it was going to be kind of a little bit more interesting conversation just because I was assuming he was going to be cheaper than he is. At 2,400, I think he's playable, especially, in your larger field stuff. I don't know that I'll get to him in 3 max. If I do, it would just be simply like, I need somebody at this price, and I guess he's the guy, that fits. But, I wish he were cheaper because then it would be a really interesting conversation. Like, even if they play a lot of 12 personnel, I have a hard time thinking that he's like getting a ton of targets. I think it's that he's probably getting an extra target or 2 compared to if they don't.
Yep. I keep on forgetting to move this down. Okay. I think we've talked about all of the tight ends enough. Would you be willing to play 2 tight ends from the same team together? I guess we'll cover that.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Yeah. Because one, it's Showdown, and one of them is going to be cheap. And, if one of them scores a touchdown, there's a decent chance that they end up being optimal because they are cheap. But also there is, especially in the Eagles case, obviously there's the negative correlation of for every pass attempt, only one person can catch it. For every touchdown, only one person can score it, obviously. And then obviously there's always the positive correlation of if the Eagles offense does really well, all players are better. But there is also, just from a matchup standpoint, if the Eagles were to just, let's say, just for the sake of what I'm about to say, if they were to use 12 personnel 100% of the time, they never use a third wide receiver, that's good for both tight ends. And, if obviously it's not going to be 100%, but if they were to use it a lot more than people are anticipating, that's good for both.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I think it's totally in play. All right, we're way over time, so we'll go quickly. Defenses. I have a lot of interest generally in defenses and kickers. I think this Eagles defense I still think could be better than it was last year. They didn't look great last week against Green Bay, but again, I think that might have been due to the field conditions in Brazil not being great. I think that does favor the offense in general because the defense has to react. It's a little bit tougher. You got to turn on a dime, whereas the offense knows where they're going. So I think it favors the offense when you have slippery field conditions. So I'm still hopeful that this Eagles defense is going to be better than it was last year. Also, Kirk Cousins, just a complete statue. So I think that there are sack opportunities there. I think I'll be pretty into the Eagles defense. Also, the Falcons defense, Jalen Hurts took threw the third most interceptions, threw 15 interceptions last year, third most in the NFL. Also took the 11th most sacks with 36. And the Falcons, I think, are going to be really low owned. I think some people will be on the Eagles. I don't think a ton of the people are going to be playing the Falcons defense, and they're only 3,400. So I really like both of the defense. I think kicker is always a pretty good bet on Showdown. How do you feel about any of these, Adam?
Yeah, so the defenses I think are pretty much correctly owned. I prefer the Eagles, but they are also $1,000 more expensive. They're showing up as optimal like 19% of the time for me at flex compared to 10% for the Falcons. Same reasons you said. You have Kirk Cousins, second game back from an Achilles injury. He's never been a mobile quarterback anyway. Falcons O-line graded out really poorly in week 1. Last year, they were a top 10 unit. Eagles pass rush graded out really poorly in week 1. Last year, they were a top 10 unit. So don't really know what to make of them specifically, but there is just obviously, Cousins isn't moving very much if you can get pressure. And you never want to, because of the way DFS scoring is, like look at defense as far as thinking about if they're going to prevent points. But if you can predict teams that are going to get pressure on the quarterback, that does obviously lead to mistakes, which can lead to defensive touchdowns and it leads directly to sacks. So I do like that. And then on the other side, you do have Hurts, who can be turnover prone, and an Eagles offensive line that is still figuring out how to work together. So there is upside for both of these defenses. Kickers, the game is outdoors, which isn't as ideal as if it's indoors, but the kickers still look fine here, especially going through this show. There's just been so much the skill players look good, they have talent, but I'm not super confident they're actually going to be that good in this game. If you get, it's not hard, I don't think, just to envision that game where the Eagles kind of have trouble moving the ball because of missing AJ Brown. The Falcons have trouble moving the ball because Kirk Cousins isn't good anymore potentially, or is at least still rusty or whatever, where you just kind of get like a low scoring game and the kickers matter.
All right. And questions let us, I'll just ask you, favorite play under 4,000. Somebody asked us on the first show. I thought that was a good question. You nailed it with Alan Lazard on that first show. So let's just get one final question out before we end the stream.
Under 4,000, so Johan Dotson doesn't count.
I guess you could include Johan Dotson if you want to.
It's like Johan Dotson or Ray McLeod. Going beyond that, if he plays Johnny Wilson at 1K.
Yeah, and I think those are all pretty good bets. I'm tempted to just go with the Falcons defense because they are pretty cheap, and I don't think people are going to play them. So just from a contrarian standpoint, I think they're going to go too low owned for their range of outcomes. Yeah, I'll stick with it. Falcons defense, I'll go with. But I like your calls also. All right, Adam. Any final plugs? Where can people find you going in the near future?
I'm going to be doing my baseball tournament show on the Endgame channel around 5 Eastern today. Just looking through what my player exposures would look like for large field DraftKings tournaments. So if you're still playing MLB DFS, check that out. I know they have a $25K to first, $15 tournament today. They have a $50K to first $100 tournament. So it's still money to be made in baseball. Going to be doing that. But the Endgame channel, I have some sort of content on there pretty much every day during the week. I have a Sunday morning NFL show that I think competes with yours. So definitely watch that.
Before mine.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe runs into it.
Yeah, so watch mine and then watch Neil's. But my stuff's over there. And then again, links are in the description for the show on Endgame. Both to sign up for Endgame if you want the full product, access to all of those other guys, their training videos, instructional videos. Should definitely help you get better at DFS, improve your process, make more money going forward, save you costs on other subscriptions as you learn to do more things on your own. But if that doesn't make sense for your volume, you can just get my content with the content link as well.
Nice. First of all, Charles Moran, good to see you here. I don't think I've seen you on this channel yet, but thank you for the reminder. Yeah, please do hit the like on both of our channels, subscribe, etc., etc. All is very helpful, very much appreciated. I will be back tonight, 90 minutes prior to lock, once inactives are out. So when we have a little bit more information, I'll be able to break things down a little bit easier with some of these situations that are uncertain right now. So you can check that out tonight on the Flannelverse channel. All right, that's going to do it for this stream. Thank you guys very much, and I'll catch you later.